To me, it's astonishing.
Here, you're really being told your job's in jeopardy if you speak out.
My whole career has been going around saying the climate changes all the time. Get used to it, understand it. Stop lurching from one crisis to the next.
I don't think fear is a constructive sentiment. It's a political trick.
The fear element drives the media, and the media drives the hype.
Welcome to Exposed, the Climate of Fear. I want you to know right up front, this is not a balanced look at global warming. It is the other side of the climate debate that you don't hear anywhere. And yes, Al Gore, there is another credible side. We'll get to Al Gore and his inconvenient truths about his movie in just a little bit. But I want to start with what we do know. The globe is getting warmer. In fact, it's warmed 0.7 degrees Celsius over the last 100 years. It's not up for debate, but there are questions as to why it's happening, how catastrophic it may be, who's right, who's wrong. Unfortunately, when it comes to climate, it takes years, even generations, to find out. So the only way to judge is to look back. Now, 10 years ago, the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, had begun to convince many that global warming was caused by us, man. So the world reacted. They crafted what's called the Kyoto Protocol. This is, according to many environmentalists, the gold standard of worldwide efforts to limit emissions of greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide by industrialized nations that most blame for global warming. That's us. So what is the legacy of Kyoto? Well, once you realize how many holes there are in the consensus solution, you may begin to open up your mind to the other side of the global warming debate as a whole.
Who knew climate could be so volatile?
Mr. Bush is breaking the international agreement.
Anger, protests, scorn against America and President Bush for refusing to ratify the Kyoto Protocol.
It was not a popular position in parts of the world.
Yeah, it really wasn't. 170 countries have ratified Kyoto, many promising to reduce their greenhouse gases to below 1990 levels.
There is no time to lose.
Amidst international pressure, the U.S. and Australia have refused to participate.
They shall go on, implement the Kyoto Treaty. Do not wait for Bush.
Why? When the U.S. is responsible for 20% of all man-made greenhouse gases, why refuse to join the rest of the world? I mean, other than to purely annoy these people. Because, quite simply, the Kyoto Protocol is a joke. A really unfunny and expensive joke.
3/4 of the total expense would fall upon the United States.
I think there's only 2 countries that are even coming close to meeting their targets.
The amount of warming that would be prevented per half-century is 0.07 of a degree Celsius.
It does not include China, India, Brazil, and these countries are all industrializing rapidly.
Kyoto encourages people to run the hell away from it.
We didn't feel like the Kyoto Treaty was well balanced. It didn't include developing nations.
Developing nations like China and India aren't mandated to reduce their emissions under Kyoto. That's a big problem for the U.S., especially since many developing nations are big polluters.
It used to be thought that by 2020, that China was going to pass the United States in carbon dioxide emissions. New data says it's going to happen in 2009.
Even our vice president thought it was ridiculous.
It is a ridiculous notion.
No. I don't mean that vice president. I mean this one.
We will not submit this for ratification until there's meaningful participation by key developing nations.
Yeah, you heard right. Back in 1997, Al Gore set the standard that the U.S. will not comply with Kyoto as long as big polluters like China don't have to.
That's the Gore standard. That standard still has not been met. That was the standard George Bush articulated too, but he's mean.
Today I reaffirm my personal and announce our nation's commitment to reducing our emissions of greenhouse gases.
Clinton signed the Kyoto Protocol, announced his commitment to it, but never sent it to Congress to be ratified.
Just like George Bush has never undertaken the purely protocol step of asking the Senate to vote on Kyoto, neither did Bill Clinton for 801 days of his presidency.
Why? because they knew the Senate had already voted down a Kyoto-type deal by the razor-thin margin of 95 to 0. There's another problem. The targets are next to impossible to meet.
Take a look at some of these sort of mid-major nations in Europe, Spain, Portugal, etc. Their emissions are going up like crazy, 50, 60%.
As a matter of fact, meeting targets is such a problem, some countries are resorting to more drastic measures.
There are examples of Chinese factories that are being used to buy credits for European countries. So European countries can say, well, we can pollute because we're reducing pollution in China.
It's an indulgence.
Europe, especially, is having issues. Of the main 15 European nations to ratify Kyoto, only 2 say they will actually meet their targets, the UK and Sweden. 6 more countries say, well, you know, with a little more work and a lot more money, we might be able to make it kind of happen. And the remaining 7, they're not even pretending. They say there's no way they'll ever meet their targets.
The writers underestimated the demand for energy that people have, that you just will not be able to withdraw energy from people once they've had it.
John Christie is the director of the Earth System Science Center at the University of Alabama and the state's climatologist. Christie played a major role in the 2001 science report used to mold the direction of the Kyoto Protocol.
In IPCC 2001, I was a lead author.
The IPCC report, brought to you by the United Nations, is the supposed consensus you're always hearing about. The one, when translated by alarmists, is the call to action because of the dire consequences of global warming on the Earth.
We have to make this report so dramatic.
But Christie says what he saw behind the scenes was more alarming than those alleged dire consequences.
I was at a table with 3 Europeans. We were having lunch. And they were talking about their role as lead authors. And they were talking about how they were trying to make the report so dramatic that the United States would just have to sign up to the Kyoto Protocol.
Don't be poor in a hot country.
Since then, several more reports have been issued.
Don't live in Hurricane Alley.
The most recent report was released this past April.
Watch out about being on the coasts or in the Arctic,
where the current lead author described their findings.
If you're in a Mediterranean climate, you're going to have a fire season in the summer. It's really going to be a problem.
All scientists are affected by bias, every single one of them.
The Kyoto Protocol is probably the best example of something working precisely as it was designed, which is to fail.
The Kyoto Protocol is dead.
When Al Gore testified before Congress on global warming just a couple of months ago, it was a media circus. But also testifying that day without any fanfare, really any coverage, was Bjorn Lomborg. He's the author of the best-selling book, The Skeptical Environmentalist. He's an expert on the economic impact of global warming. Bjorn, you are not a scientist, you're a political scientist, so I'm not going to ask you any science questions. I want to ask you, as a guy who believes in man-made global warming, why don't you think Kyoto is the solution?
Well, essentially exactly because of what you showed in the clip. Kyoto is at the same time impossibly ambitious and yet entirely inconsequential when you talk about the environment. It'll cost lots of money and end up doing virtually no good. That's not a good deal.
Let me show the chart.
What we need to look at is to try to find smarter ways.
This is the chart. This is the impact of Kyoto here on this chart compared to if we do nothing?
Yes. Basically, no change. It'll basically postpone global warming for about 5 years at the end of the century.
Okay,
that's not a very good deal.
Let me play devil's advocate here. Al Gore has made mention of malaria a lot. Some people say we could save 100,000 people on malaria alone if we do something about global warming. Why wouldn't we save 100,000 people?
We could probably save about 85 million people from malaria if we did something about malaria. These people are suffering right now. Why is it we're talking about making very expensive moves, doing virtually no good 100 years from now, when there are real people that we can really save very cheaply from malaria right now?
Okay, we just had a situation, I don't remember what it was, just a few years ago, where we had a massive heat wave in Europe. 35,000 people in France alone died. Another 2,000 people died from this heat wave in England. If we don't stop global warming, won't things just get worse and worse and more people will die just from the heat?
Glenn, that's exactly true, and that's, of course, what Al Gore tells us. With global warming, you're going to see more heat deaths. But what most people don't tell us is We're also going to see